everyone. Welcome. Good evening. Thank you for coming to the library. I'm Ellen Sullivan-Cravato. I'm the CEO, and I am delighted to welcome you to our program tonight. Please silence your phones and take a look at where the exits are to either side of you. 1.3 million. Who knows what that number is? Can't raise your hand, Mickey. Christina knows. What is it? Number of visitors since we opened our doors in 2023. Isn't that amazing? I can't say thank you enough to all the people who support the library and the annual fund every year. You're the people that are making all of this great programming possible. Thank you so much. We have until June 30 to hit our numbers this year. Our goal is over $1 million, so I really hope you can join us in our endeavors. I also really want to talk to you about a couple of very exciting programs that are coming up. On June 6th, we're hosting our massive annual Groove on the Green event, which this year is going to be a disco party outside for about 900 people. So I hope you can all join for that. We have DJ Lucas Walters coming from New York City, which will take us back to our salad days of disco dancing in the 70s and 80s. And for anybody who has forgotten how to do the hustle in the last 50 years, we've got the Fred Astaire dance studio people coming to teach free lessons. Bring your own picnic, bring your own wine. Police people don't listen to that. And we also have the Avellino barbecue food truck coming in. If you were here last year, you'll know they're extraordinary. So speaking of disco in the 80s, I also am thrilled to mention that we have best-selling author Jonathan Mahler coming. He has written this book, in case you don't know it, The Gods of New York. So we're back to talking about what's going on in the mid-80s. He'll be coming on June 11, right? And that's going to be a fantastic evening as well. And I want you to also make sure you're registered for What the Constitution Means to Me. This is a Connecticut Stages production, a one-woman show featuring Kate Baldwin, who originated this role on Broadway. It is free. All you have to do is register, and we're doing this in celebration of the America 250 programming here at the library. And I also want to make sure that you have seen that we have attracted Martha Graham Dance Company to New Canaan. We're going to be expanding the stage. They're going to be doing a full-blown performance, in fact, 3 of them. One that's family-friendly, and then 2 other programs in the evening. So if this is all news to you, I just want to say it's because you're not signed up for the newsletter. So if you need to get on that, just go to the website or talk to one of us here tonight. This evening, we have best-selling author Douglas Brunt here to talk about his new book, The Lost Empire of Emanuel Nobel. He's the New York Times best-selling author of The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel and host of the top-rated SiriusXM author podcast, Dedicated with Doug Brunt. The Lost Empire is a narrative nonfiction book that reveals the hidden history of one of the world's most successful business titans, Emanuel Nobel. Nobel was heir to a powerful petroleum empire, and his innovations helped build the modern oil age. He was a rival to the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. However, his legacy was erased in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. Now, as some of you may know, I spent many years traveling to and working in Russia. So when I heard that we had the chance to have this book and author come to the library, I jumped on it. It is an absolutely astounding and wonderful book, and I know you're all going to love it. I think of it as a thriller, as a sweeping family saga, the story of how one family built a global fortune, and it's also a foundational account of the origins of the global oil industry, which frankly couldn't be a more timely subject. In addition, it's the kind of story that brings a whole new dimension to a family that we might have all thought we knew pretty well, the Nobels, who, as it turns out, owe their international legacy to a simple error in a newspaper obituary, which is truly incredible and speaks to the power of how one decision can result in unforeseen consequences in world history. Best-selling author and ESPN writer Seth Wickersham joins Douglas to discuss this work. Seth is a senior writer at ESPN and the New York Times best-selling author of American Kings, a biography of the quarterback, and It's Better to Be Feared, the New England Patriots dynasty in the pursuit of greatness. He's promised to come back and do a sports talk with us, which is great. Like Douglas, he also lives in Connecticut with his family. I sure hope he's going to come back and talk to us about football soon. Doug and Seth will talk about the book and then take questions from you in the audience, so please wait until we reach you with a microphone before you ask your question. Elm Street Book is on hand as always, thank you. To sell books, we will be doing Q&A. Please join me in welcoming Douglas and Seth to our stage.
All right, thank you guys. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Ellen for that kind introduction. I indeed did write a book about quarterbacks called American Kings and had the marketing misfortune of writing a book called American Kings at the exact same time as No Kings protests around the country. So, and I want to just say, before we get started, a thank you to Doug, because it's one thing to be an author. It's another thing to go out and talk about your book and try to promote it. It's another thing to actively read authors and produce a platform for them to talk about their work and support the genre. And you do that with your podcast, and I appreciate it, and it was a thrill for me to be able to do it. So you're the author of 5 books, 2 nonfiction books, and in some ways, this book is a sequel, or it's a successor to your first nonfiction book. And I wanted to know, like, what is it about this time period, about a century ago, that fascinates you so much?
Well, Seth, thanks very much for doing this event. We have met before. He did come on my podcast, and just a quick word on American Kings, which is a terrific book. It's about the quarterback position and the history of the position. Beyond that, it really examines what it takes to succeed and excel at a high level, not just as an NFL quarterback or even in sports, but really in any discipline. I mean, the book applies to all of life. So if you are someone who loves the NFL, that's sort of a bonus on top, but it's a really terrific book, American Kings, which you should totally check out because you're a very talented writer as well. And thanks for doing this. The period in this book, and also in The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel, it's the decades leading up to and including, in this case, World War I. And I love that period. It's a period that Barbara Tuchman in some of her books has explored. It's a crazy hinge point in history that is a huge change in the way that people lived. If you think about the world before World War I and all the empires that were there, the German Empire, Ottoman Empire, Austrian Empire, Russian Empire, it all collapsed as a result of World War I. And you know, I jokingly refer to this time period with my wife as Downton Abbey, the early years. It's just a totally different kind of world that Europe in particular lived in that time. So it's kind of a charming, romantic, atmospheric setting for these books. Now, it's a setting of a nonfiction book, you know, but it's the time period that I've chosen to examine. When I was a kid, I loved World War II. I was always watching any documentary I could find on World War II and the Nazis. Harrison, you made it. Good to see you. And so I was really obsessed with World War II, and it's also the Star Wars, you know, the good versus evil, Empire Strikes Back period of history, and it's sort of clear cut in that way. And the more I got into World War I and the forces in the decades leading up to World War I that created this crazy calamity, it's way more nuanced, and I found way more interesting. You know, the emperors of the sort of the 3 emperor league, Russia, Germany, and then the king in Britain, they're all cousins. And they had these sort of little spats between them. And the most unlikely countries become allies and others become enemies. And, you know, at the end of World War I, this horrible, destructive war, really our first mechanized war, first time we have trucks and planes, ships are running fuel oil instead of coal. At the end of it, they kind of looked around like, why in the heck did we just do that? And just as we're starting to sort of examine that as a you know, the people of Europe, World War II happens. And so the whole history kind of gets paved over. We don't even really digest what went on before we're on to the next one. And so that whole time period has so much unexplored history to it that's been really fun to dig into with both of these books.
How did you find this story?
The Nobel story came out of the Diesel book. The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel is about the man who invented the diesel engine. And as I sort of quip after the book, people mistakenly spell diesel with a lowercase d, but it's really the man's name, the last name Diesel. And when he released the diesel engine in 1897, he did international licensing by national territory for the exclusive rights to manufacture and market the diesel engine. And the person who took the license for diesel in the Russian Empire was Emanuel Nobel. And we know the last name Nobel from Alfred Nobel, who invented dynamite and established the Nobel Prizes. Alfred is the uncle of Emanuel Nobel. And the Russian Nobels, so Alfred got out of Russia, went back to Sweden, and then lived variously in France and Italy. But Emanuel Nobel and his relatives stayed in Russia. And in the north of Russia, by St. Petersburg, they established one of the largest machine factories and munitions factories in all of Russia. They built rifles and bombs and engines and diesel engines for the Tsar. And in the south of Russia, they pioneered the Russian oil industry. And they ended up building one of the largest oil concerns in the world, and then by 1900, the largest. They surpassed even Standard Oil to become the largest oil company in the whole world. And that was still the case in 1914 when the war broke out. They were the most important source of oil for what was our first mechanized war, and yet we don't know the name. It's another case in like diesel where we've sort of forgotten the name. It's been a little bit buried from history, and we may get into this a bit, but the reason we don't know the name is we had the Bolshevik Revolution. Joseph Stalin, Lenin, Trotsky, they take over, they nationalize everything, and the collision between the communists and Nobel, what Joseph Stalin does to Emanuel Nobel, is ultimately the inspiration for George Orwell's 1984. There's a passage in that novel where they talk about they change the street names, they tear down the statues, and they rewrite the history. He's talking about what Stalin did to Nobel and other industrialists like him, completely buried and rewrote the history and just painted on a new one.
Just about your process for a second, when you're looking at exploring whether something's a book, what traits and characters do you like the most? Like, what do you look for in your characters?
You know, with all of these books, I want it to be, the best way to tell history, I think, is in a narrative, to have a story. And I was actually just talking to my wife about this the other day, and my kids as well. When they go through a history book, it reads like an itinerary of events, which means nothing. You know, it's just something to memorize. It's like memorizing the bones and the skeleton. And it only matters if you get a sense of how lives changed day to day. You know, I went to bed this day, and then Bloody Sunday broke out in St. Petersburg, and the next day it was like this. This is what it was like to walk on the streets, and you see people riding the sideboards of cars they've commandeered with pitchforks and rifles and blood in the streets and all that sort of thing. You want to experience the history through a person or a family with the broad backdrop, broad canvas backdrop of the big events, World War I and the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War. So I'm looking for people who've been underappreciated, but who have played a role. And in particular with Diesel, with Nobel, there's a third book that I'm just starting on, which I haven't talked about what it is yet, but it's underway. It'll be the same through line here. Someone who's had a major impact, but sort of under the radar. And when you examine them as your sort of guide through this narrative history, halfway through you realize, oh my gosh, this person had enormous influence on politics, industry, military. And by following their lives, we experience the big historical moments.
So your book just comes out this week, and you already are at work on your next one. Like, way to make everybody else feel like a slacker. My editor is always saying, when I'm in writing, to stick with the scenes. Like, if you have a good scene, it can say more in 50 words than in 20 pages sometimes. And, you know, when you're doing it, the ideal situation is to witness the scene live. Obviously, you're writing about moments that happened a long, long time ago. There's no eyewitnesses. You have to recreate them. How do you do that?
One great place to start is memoirs, you know, contemporaneous memoirs, getting a feel for the streets of St. Petersburg at the time of the Revolution. There's some amazing memoirs by foreign diplomats living in St. Petersburg. The diplomat from France wrote a great one. The diplomat from America, the American ambassador in St. Petersburg wrote a great one. Letters, diaries, And also, fortunately, in the time period I'm working with, photographs, because that you can look at the photograph and actually get a feel for things too. But it's also, I've talked to a lot of archivists, and we've referred to this period from the late 1800s through to about 1960 is the golden age of letter writing. And I don't know what we're going to do 50 years from now if someone tries to write about this decade. There are no letters. It's all text messages and snaps that will vanish, and there's nothing to read. But the archives are full of incredible letters and things that people have kept that you can sift through. And that can help you get the atmosphere right, not only of the place, but of the characters. You get to know after spending 5 years on Diesel, and then, there's some overlap, but 5 on Nobel. You get to know the person a bit through these documents, reading what they've written, but also reading what their friends have written about them, or just their exchange of letters. And you can get a good feel, and then if you've spent enough time doing all that, it can come through with some force on the page when you try to write it, because you're writing about it with a little more confidence.
Yeah, it's a great point, because there are so many moments where the letter actually plays a key character almost at moments of the book, whether it's love letters or letters from Stalin to Nobel, whatever, it's a fascinating thing. I mean, that was the primary means of communication, and you were able to use that to great effect. Authors are interesting because you get involved in a book and it becomes all-encompassing, and it ends up, you're stressed, you're eager, you're tired, you're running on fumes, but you're also, tapping into this well of knowledge that you've accumulated that you kind of can't wait to share. And I'm curious, what are you like to be around on a daily basis when you're working on a book?
We have, I really have
Maybe
to
we
answer
can-
this
maybe
very
we can-
honestly, because there's some people who could call me
Yes.
out here in the front row. I think, we'll find out if this is even close to the mark, I think I'm a delight. I'm a great guy. But I feel like if I have had a good few hours writing, I don't know when you like to write or how you block out your time, because you've got a few balls in the air, you've got a number of different things going professionally. And the podcast actually has been a great thing for me to sort of mix up my work hours. But I'd like to finish off the school drop. My wife and I each do a drop. We go different directions, and we then alternate that the next day. And then I try to get back in the chair by 8:30 and write for 4 hours. Give or take. Depends on good day, bad day, but that's the average. And if I have a good writing day, I am feeling great the rest of the day. I'm like, I'll even sort of announce it sometimes at dinner, like 700 words today, felt good.
The air smells better,
Yes.
Coffee tastes better, yeah.
Life is good.
Yes.
And sometimes it's much less, sometimes it could be much more, but then in the afternoons it's really more for editing what I did that morning, or doing additional research to sort of plug a hole where I know I need to I've got some gaps in my research, but do things other than putting a few pages on the pile. That's really more for the mornings. I feel like I'm thinking best then. But if I do put a few pages on the pile, I feel great. And then if I have days where that's not happening, then I am feeling a little sort of out of sorts. But still a delight, I think.
Still a delight. Yeah, that's a jarringly efficient, way to go about this. I wish that I were that efficient. Turning to some details about the book. I mean, early on, you write about Nobel's, the family business philosophy. And Ludwig is Emanuel's father. And I'm curious, I found it interesting the way that he ran his business and the way that he wanted his employees to feel as employees. And I'm curious, can you explain, how did he want them to feel?
He had what I think was a pragmatic view of it. I mean, he recognized the value of happy, engaged employees. And that was not the case in Russia. I mean, Russia,
Right.
They were just coming off serfdom, and particularly in southern Russia, in Baku, which is modern-day Azerbaijan, but at the time was part of the Russian Empire, it was a brutal place to work. It was dangerous. If you're out in the oil fields on one of the drilling rigs, sometimes you had to go down to fix something, like 50% chance you're not coming back out. A lot of people would die in the oil rigs. The living conditions were abysmal. But Nobel invested in schools and hospitals and employee housing, and he built sort of leisure pastime activities for the employees, such that the employees took pride in working there. They would call themselves Nobelites, and they were happy to be. It was the place where you wanted to work. And this paid dividends for him in a number of ways. Not only were they productive, but when things really hit the fan, 1905, there's an abortive revolution that it takes place in part in southern Russia, and his employees protected him. They were like, wait, no, he's not the capitalist pig, quote unquote, that you guys are after, that you want to take out. And his employees would not damage his infrastructure. They would protect him. Sabotage is happening at all of his competitors, particularly the Rothschilds, in part because they were Jewish, and anti-Semitism was rampant throughout Europe, but particularly bad in Russia. So the Rothschilds suffered an enormous amount of sabotage. But Nobel's employees were more his protectors, and this again, not to give away much of the ending here, but his employees continue to look out for his interests even in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution and the Russian Civil War, when the communists are coming for him.
I drew that line also because he created loyalty, an atmosphere of loyalty at an incredibly difficult time to do it, and I think it trickled down to his son. We'll get to that in a second, but there's a lot of violence in this book. There's a lot of explosions, which kind of reminded me of watching my son play Minecraft, and there was a lot of really brutal killings, and it was gutting to watch so many people die. And there was one in particular, like when you write a book, you end up with so many characters that you want to take little detours, but you can't take detours that are so long that you lose the character. I think that like The West Wing did it really well, where they were talking about you got to give each character their moment on stage. And Alexander II, I kind of found him to be, there's a brief but important moment where, he's essentially killed by a suicide bomber. But if that he isn't killed at age 62 in that moment, how does that change the trajectory of Russia?
It's incredible. There are a number of sliding doors moments in Russia because they have this repeating cycle of reform, repress, and Alexander II was for a time a reformer. He's the one who freed the serfs in 1861, and he was also implementing other liberalizing reforms around freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, which of course opened the door for subversives to assemble and to talk and to gather, and ultimately he is assassinated. But Russia was on its way to baby steps toward a constitutional monarchy. And had that happened, they might have been one of the only major powers to do that without blood. It's incredible. But just what you were saying there made me think of the many detours one can take, and I think your editor is giving you this advice. You can take some detours, you can establish some character, you can do a scene. And the scenes are wonderful if you can get it. You can go on a little run, like a little narrative run with a scene, as long as it's in service of the characters. If it's got to be worthwhile, because you can't take too many tangents or you lose the propulsiveness of the narrative. But one cool scene that I love in the book, let me see if this clicker works. Or if I know how. It definitely works.
A moment of truth if we can figure out how to work this thing.
I did it. In the lower left, you'll see that's the Nobel ice egg, built, designed and produced by Fabergé. And in 1911, sorry if I'm jumping around here, but this was like one of the narrative runs where Emanuel Nobel was the largest customer of Fabergé in Russia. And he would host these large banquets for business partners and dignitaries, and he went to the offices of Fabergé in St. Petersburg, and he said, I'm having this big group of 50 dignitaries and spouses over, and for every woman in attendance, in her napkin, I want a surprise piece of jewelry, of diamonds and platinum. And so he's sitting there on this freezing February morning in St. Petersburg, and Peter Carl Fabergé has already identified this young woman, she's 22, named Alma Peel, as his lead designer. She's sort of the star Fabergé designer. And Emanuel Nobel says, I wanted to have something that reflects the nature of St. Petersburg. So they have a little meeting, and then he leaves, Alma Peel's sitting at her drafting table, and she's got the paper out, and the sun comes up, and it hits the frost, the ice frost in the window pane, and lights up the frost. And she's like, it sounds a little apocryphal, but I think it's true. It's written about in the Fabergé lore. And she said, that's it. It's like a winter motif. So she designs it, and she makes these little brooches for all the women who come to the party, and they extend this winter motif to the Nobel ice egg. So on the right is a pendant watch called the surprise pendant watch, and it fits inside the egg. And it's so cool that the Tsar comes to Nobel, and he's like, hey, Emanuel, I love this winter motif. Because he's commissioned it, he owns the design at Fabergé. And the Tsar says, do you mind? And he says, sure. And so there's also an imperial egg. There are about 48 or 44, I can't remember the number exactly, but there are some in the 40s imperial Fabergé eggs, Easter eggs, that the Tsar would give to his wife on Easter. And then Nicholas did the same for his wife and his mother. And then there are a handful that are considered imperial quality, and this Nobel Fabergé egg is one of the few considered imperial quality. So it was a great little narrative run in the book. So it's not all blood and killing. There's a lot, but there are also some fun things.
And I was also hoping that little detour would end with saying that inspired the NBA Finals championship trophy. Emanuel was interesting because he was the only Nobel executive of his oil empire. Like, it wasn't exactly, he wasn't technically an only child, but in some ways it kind of felt like it because there was such a gap between his siblings. And I'm curious for your opinion about how you think him running that business, that empire alone, affected him as a leader.
He had a lot of responsibility. He had some very talented executives around him, but you're right, he was the only sort of blood Nobel owner. He had some half-brothers. His father married, the first wife passed away, and then Emanuel's much closer in age brother passed away. When the father remarried, so Emanuel has a bunch of half-siblings who are all much, much younger, close to 20 years younger. So they don't play a role until like the 1920s, really. And it was very much on his shoulders, two huge businesses. And when he first took over in 1888, when his father died, he was 29 years old, just when the oil business was large enough that the Tsar himself is coming down to Baku along the Caspian Sea to examine this oil concern that the Nobels have built. So he's newly in the role of running the whole thing. He's also overseeing the St. Petersburg factories, and he hosts the Tsar, the Tsarina, and the Tsarevich, who becomes the last Tsar, Nicholas II, who was famously executed by the communists. So that whole entourage and hundreds of troops and their whole entourage come down, and he does such an effective job hosting them that they offer him Russian citizenship. He's the only Nobel who ever becomes an actual Russian citizen in 1888. But he was a really gifted leader. He wasn't an engineer, but he was sort of grew up in the halls of government ministries in St. Petersburg, so he was almost like an effective diplomat and financial leader. When he first took the role, Alfred, who was an investor, Alfred Nobel of the Nobel Prize, was already very wealthy from his dynamite business, and he was investing in the company and was an advisor to his nephew, Emanuel. And in the very beginning, he was concerned. He's like, I don't think this kid can do it. And there are even letters to that effect of Alfred writing the other board directors of the Nobel Petroleum Company, I'm not sure this guy is ready to do the job. And right away, he faces a few challenges, though, including hosting the Tsar and a little disruption on the board, which he handles really deftly. And within a year, Alfred says, I was wrong. This is the guy. And Alfred's a brilliant guy, and he recognizes in Emanuel that he is the leader. He had been concerned it was too big a concern for one person to oversee, but he changes his tune and recognizes that Emanuel's the right guy.
And this is something I didn't know. Another little detour. I had no idea that there was some dispute over what the Nobel Prize was actually intended to award. And I was like, there's some mythology behind it too. And I was curious if you could just explain that for everyone in the audience, because there's competing theories.
The origins of the prize, let me make sure I'm answering your question correctly, because I'm not sure exactly, but when Emanuel's father passed away in 1888, it was Ludwig Nobel who passed away. Mm-hmm. And so just to briefly spend a second on the generations, there's the grandfather, He's also named Emanuel. Three
Emanuel
sons,
with
for
an
the
I.
sake of this, with an I, right?
Yeah.
Then there's Robert Ludwig and Alfred Nobel. And then Ludwig has Emanuel Nobel, our guy here. So when Ludwig dies, the father of Emanuel here, in 1888, he's a very well-known guy internationally. Again, the communists sort of buried the story of the Russian Nobels. But Alfred's over in Paris when this happens, running his dynamite business and being a millionaire. And he, alive and well, picks up his newspaper in France that has messed up the story of who died. They mistakenly say that Alfred Nobel dies. So Alfred is alive and well, reads the newspaper that has his own obituary. Mm-hmm. And it goes on to say he's a merchant of death for the creation of dynamite. He's killed more people than any other human in human history. And he's like, my God, this is not how I want to be remembered. And so he then rewrites his will to establish the Nobel Prizes to award the person who has done the most for humankind in the prior year across a number of disciplines. And so that's in 1888. Alfred then does die in 1996. And then there's a huge controversy around the will because he'd rewritten it by hand and he had about 33 million kroner when he passed away. And he allocated 31 of the 33 to the prizes and just 2 to his family. And the family's sitting around, this is not what we expected. We thought we were getting the 33. And so they fight the will. And there was also a pacifist movement going on around the world at this time that was fully, lay down the arms. And Alfred had become close with some of the leading pacifists. Not every king and prime minister was on board with full pacifism. They did have military budgets, and nationalism and militarism was the competing philosophy. And so the king of Sweden pulls Emanuel aside. Emanuel has been assigned as the custodian of the will. And in Russia, that translates to the custodian of the soul. And it's a responsibility that he took very seriously. And so he goes to meet the king of Sweden, who pulls him aside and said, listen, you really shouldn't do this prize thing that your uncle Alfred wanted to do. He was overly influenced by these pacifists. Take care of your family. We're going to make this Nobel Prize thing go away. Just give it to your family. And Emanuel says no. And he goes back to the hotel, and his valet is there. And the valet knows what happens when you say no to a czar in Russia. So he's like, so we're packing the bags and getting out of here immediately, right? He's like, no, we're not in that kind of trouble. But he says no to the king. He pulls his family together for a big meeting, and he says, look, we need to honor Alfred's last will, and we should establish his prize. He talks them all into it. They do establish the prize. There is some litigation around all that, including a mistress that Alfred had who came with her hand out. So they gave her a bit. But in 1901, they award the first Nobel Prize. And in typical Emanuel fashion, you talk about getting to know the character a bit, he never put himself in the limelight. He always put Alfred's legacy into the limelight. To this day, like even in Sweden, we went there on a family trip where I spent some time in the archives. We walk around, it's all Alfred Nobel. The Nobel Prize would never have happened if it weren't for Emanuel Nobel making sure that this happened, standing up to a king, standing up to the whole family, but always staying in the background, always making sure it's Alfred's name and legacy that gets gilded. But it would not have happened without his intervention.
And also just like rewriting your own obituary is such a millennial thing. And it's good to see that it's a timeless tradition going back maybe to a different kind of millennial. Okay, Stalin, not a great human. Yet he's humanized in this book, at least as a child and as a young adult. And so I want to talk about him as a character. When you look at him, not as a historical figure, but as a character in a book that adds up to a larger story you're trying to tell. Tell me why explaining where he came from was vital.
Yeah, it's all the worst guys and gals were once little boys and little girls, and you read these stories about Stalin. When the Soviet Union fell in 91, a lot of archives became available, and we learned a lot more about the early years of Stalin that he had worked to cover up and hide, because he really was sort of a gangster. This is not someone you would expect to become head of a state. He was born in the country of Georgia as a neighbor to Nobel and Rothschild and their oil enterprises in the south of Russia. And so he sort of had this front row seat to the, quote unquote, capitalist pigs that he came to loathe. He even worked in the oil fields of Rothschild and Nobel. And he has letters from his youth mentioning the name Nobel. So these are people he's had in his sights since he was a young child. His mother was, promiscuous, maybe a prostitute. His father was an abusive alcoholic.
She did what she needed to do to make ends meet.
Yeah, and she loved him and was obsessed with him and his future, and she actually put him in the seminary. Stalin studied to be a priest in his early years, which is crazy to think about.
Of all the roads not taken.
Yeah. And so while he is in studying for the priesthood and living in the country of Georgia, he does come across young Marxists, and he joins these groups. He starts writing for some communist newspapers, and eventually, of course, abandons the priesthood and becomes a gangster in southern Russia, in the Caucasus. He's running protection schemes. He's robbing payroll wagons and sending the money off to Lenin to fund the Bolshevik Party.
Why were his path and the path of Emanuel Nobel destined to collide?
Because oil is what drives everything. I mean, it remains the story of our time. If you pick up the newspaper today, what's going on in Venezuela, Russia, the Middle East, it's all oil. And if Stalin and Lenin and Trotsky want to run a government, want to run an empire, they need the oil. And Nobel had the oil. And so this, getting back to some of the letters, you kind of referenced the one that Nobel wrote to Balfour, to Foreign Minister Balfour. In 1919, Emanuel Nobel is sort of off to the side in this resort town where he's become a refugee, hiding from the Red Army. And he knows that Stalin and the Red Army are coming for Baku because they need the oil. And so he writes to Balfour, who's off sort of trying to put together the peace from World War I in Versailles, saying, this is in the spring of 1919, he says, if Stalin and the Red Army don't get here by August, they're done. They will choke out for lack of oil. But he's coming, and Baku is presently held by about 1,000 troops. And he said, you need to come down here and reinforce your position. 1,000 troops is not going to save Baku from the Red Army. And Balfour, he recognized this. Even Churchill is saying, with 100,000 troops, we can go into Russia with just that many, which is a fraction of what they were, their involvement in World War I. And nip the Bolshevik thing in the bud. It'll never exist. But they don't. No one has an appetite. Britain had just spent 4 years in this brutal war. They'd spent nothing on social programs. No one wanted to send more sons off to die, let alone in Russia. That was just a disaster. So they don't send troops. And it all plays out exactly as Emanuel Nobel predicted. Stalin gets there in August. And he takes Baku and he takes the oil, and the Reds win the Russian Civil War. And it's, back to your point on Alexander II, there are these weird sliding doors moments. What if that didn't happen? And this is one of the craziest sliding door moments in all history, because it was very unlikely that the Bolsheviks would emerge to prevail in Russia. And we were within a breath of communism never being implemented. It had never been implemented anywhere in the world before 1917, when Lenin put communism into practice. And it almost didn't survive. There was almost no communist Russia, China, Korea, Cuba, Vietnam. We could have had a very different 20th century if Balfour and the Brits had listened to Nobel and Churchill.
Since we figured out how to put the slides up, do you mind showing everybody or explaining the meaning behind some of these photos?
The one on the upper left gives you an example of how oil was transported back when the Nobels first got down to southern Russia. That's just a mule cart with a barrel of oil. And Standard Oil was founded in 1870, and Nobel Petroleum was founded in 1873 along the Caspian Sea. When they first got down there, it still looked like an ancient land. There was so much petroleum in the ground, it would literally bubble to the surface. But there was no drilling. People would use shovels or skim it off the surface of these puddles and use it for a lubricant or a salve. But there was no drilling. There was no technology down there. It still looked kind of ancient. And that's how they would move it around, in wooden barrels that could leak and crumble. So when the Nobels got down there, with all of their expertise up in the north in St. Petersburg, they're building diesel engines and rifles and bombs. So they come down there and they put the American playbook in play in Baku. They build pipelines for distribution. They have refining infrastructure and drilling. And so immediately they become a major player in the most oil abundant place on the planet. And so that's an example of how it was, you know, in the 1870s when the Nobels first arrive, and then they just completely transform it. On the upper right is an oil derrick. So it's a wooden thing. Those things that look like mini Eiffel Towers, but they dot the landscape, thousands of them. And inside are the drilling bits and a small engine, initially a steam engine, and then they changed to diesel engines for that. We talked about the Fabergé egg. That's an oil painting of Emanuel Nobel in the top. This bottom middle is the inside of the oil derrick. The one you see upper right, this one here is the inside of that. So you can see the drill bits going down, the small engine. Over there on the left, that's wheel there is the engine, and a couple of Baku employees of the rig. And over here is Stalin's mugshot in Baku. So Baku is the home of the whole oil enterprise of the Nobels. Stalin's down there agitating workers into strikes and riots. He was known to be kind of a handsome man and apparently a sweet singer. They also said he wrote poetry and would sing and woo the ladies. When he needed a place to stay, he would either go to a brothel or a
rope's
girlfriend.
not taken. Like it was right there. You know, he could have done hair modeling.
Yep, barbershop quartet.
A lot of people would have been better off.
So he spent some time in that prison. He was in and out of the Tsar's prison system. You know, he was arrested 9 times, escaped about 8, sent off to exile in Siberia, would hop out of there and come back and then get arrested again. It was just amazing. It was, I think it was Trotsky who said the Tsarist prison system was a sieve, and Stalin certainly proved that.
The last 70 or so pages of the book, I'm not going to give it away, but you know, it's just this riveting account where, you know, these two titans, one the leader of the biggest business in the world and one a dictator, you know, are trying to figure out ways, you know, they're hunting. And, you know, you have that great moment where Emanuel is apprehended and the police let him go because they don't quite realize who he is. And, you know, they don't hold on to him longer. And if they did, his fortune may not have turned out as well. You know, when we write books, I think you want to entertain, you want to inform, you want to enlighten, but you know, you also want to impact lives. And you know, so that when someone who has your book on their shelf, when somebody asks them, you know, what is that book about, they have something to say about how it impacted them and what it meant to them personally. And I'm curious, like, what do you hope people take away from all the work you did putting this story together?
That's a great question. I haven't thought about it exactly in that way. As you were saying it, what was popping in my mind was, you know, when people point to it, I hope it's a book that people will read and then not toss away. Like, I hope they'll put it on their shelf and be like, that was a great book. And they will point to it when people come over with like, have you read this one? This is one you should read. And that they're sort of proud to keep it and maybe even use it as a reference. You know, there is an index in there. You can look up people and you can use it as an academic source as well as just, you know, a beach read. But I hope it will help explain people. You know, as you read through the book, you will feel echoes of present day in it. Like, my God, what's happening today happened here too. It happened here too. And you can learn from it. And you can, you know, as they say famously, you know, the only way to anticipate the future is by studying the past. And so I hope people will read this book and understand present day better too, and certainly how Russia came to be. I mean, this whole saga that you experienced through the life of Emanuel Nobel takes you through how the Russian Empire became Soviet Russia. And there are many forces at play that made that happen, that made it even possible to happen. But by understanding this life and by experiencing that piece of history through this life, you actually can understand how it all came to be. So I hope it helps people understand that transition in Russian history, but also helps people understand, you know, forces at play today.
It's contemporary, and you know, you wrote it. The storytelling, as you guys will all experience, is really exceptional. And you know, it's a historical book that breathes air that's of today and reads novelistic in so many moments. And so, That's not easy. We have some time for questions, so anything you guys have for Doug, please fire away.
I'm coming. Pick the wrong side.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. And Seth, great job asking questions. At least in my own view, I think one of the ways that Putin is reinforcing his credibility and control is through the glorification of the Russian Empire. As you know, he famously said the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Russian Empire. What does Putin think about Emanuel Nobel in this time period?
Well, I have wondered whether Putin would enjoy this book or not. And I'm guessing not. He seems a little more on the Stalin side of things. When you talk about the reestablishing the glory of the Russian Empire, yet another echo that we see throughout, from Peter the Great to Catherine the Great and on to Stalin, that expansion into Ukraine, Crimea, they are upset, even getting down to Constantinople, Istanbul. They want coastline on the Black Sea, a warm water port on the Black Sea that can extend into the Mediterranean. It has been an obsession with every Russian leader, whether it be a Tsar or a Soviet leader. You see that again and again. So I think there's one other point I was going to make, but I just completely forgot about it. There was another sort of parallel of what Putin is thinking, which I will come back to when I think of it.
You had a question?
Were you able to ever meet any of his descendants? Are there some in Europe still, or?
There are a few people, some great people that I met during the research. One person wrote a biography, the most recent biography of Alfred Nobel, named Ingrid Carlberg, and she's in the Swedish Academy. So there are 12 people in the Swedish Academy, and they oversee the Nobel Prize. So she was great and super helpful. She actually sent me her biography of Alfred Nobel in Word, so I could do keyword searches and find things. I did talk to a number of people who are Nobels. It's funny because some of them, if they marry in to a woman who's a Nobel, but they're a man, rather than take the guy's name, they take the Nobel name. Everyone in Sweden wants to be a Nobel. So there's some people who actually shouldn't be Nobels, but they've gone that way. But there are a number of Nobels that I did meet who talked to me about the current prize foundation, and then there's some other Nobel organizations started by other Nobels, but the main Nobels think they're rogue, and so there's actually some fighting between different Nobel charities, because I think that the main Nobel Foundation should exist to protect and preserve the main Alfred Nobel Prize. And then also some other fun folks that I came across when I was doing a lot of research on Fabergé. I wanted to get as much information on Nobel's relationship with that as I could. And so I ended up meeting a Habsburg from the Austrian Habsburg Empire. There's Giza von Habsburg, actually lives in Westchester. And he's been the custodian of the Fabergé archives. And so he was able to confirm a lot of the information for me about Nobel's connection there.
Fabergé Archives would be a great band name, by the way.
I also studied history in university and was also really drawn to this period, and the contrast you make between the way the world was leading up to World War I being so nuanced versus then just the leveling of society in so many ways, and then emerging into modern life after World War I, although it took us a while to get there. But I do have an anecdote about the King of Sweden, the same king, and I was wondering if you're familiar with it. I traveled to a border town between Norway and Sweden recently called Halden, and there's a big fortress there. And the Norwegians always had it defended, and it's up on a hill, and the Swedish king Karl XII died there. He was shot because he was trying to, break up into the fortress, and he was shot by a Norwegian soldier. So the Swedish king, Norway became independent in 1905, and the Swedish king at that time, your same king, did not want to relinquish Norway and allow it to be independent. So he had, I think it was 25,000 Swedish soldiers ready to invade and attack that same fortress. But in a reference to the modernity, the Norwegian parliament and the Swedish parliament negotiated democratically and said, you know what, we're not going to do that. We're going to let you be independent now. So they resolved it peacefully, and the Swedish king was sidelined. And I was wondering if you were familiar with that story, if that kind of rung true based on your research on the Swedish king.
I'm not familiar with that one, but that sounds fascinating. It sounds on brand. But I'll look. That was all around 1905. You're saying? Yeah. Okay. That sounds interesting. I'll look into that.
Any other questions? Oh, can you raise your hand? Oh, sorry.
I have two questions. Do you find using AI helpful at all in doing research? Then my second question pertaining to the book, how was Norway become the custodian of the Nobel Peace Prize? Was it connected? It was connected to Sweden, obviously, but it's distinctive to Norway.
I do not use AI, particularly for this. I've actually tested it a few times, because I did have archival material and, the primary documents, like this is ground zero of the proof for both Diesel and Nobel, and it's wrong a lot. I think for more established history where it's, we know when they signed the Declaration of Independence, or we know when the date John F. Kennedy was shot, like we know it. You can look online and find information about that, and that might be more reliable. For this stuff, it's so unreliable and so often wrong. There are certain things I'll check. I'll look online for, I want to see an image of the Benz motor wagon from 1885 or something like that. And that stuff, and it's wonderful to have that kind of stuff at your fingertips, and you can go sort of check on little things or get some easy information that would have, in the 80s when I was in high school, I'd have had to pull an encyclopedia off my dad's shelf and sort of thumb to it. And, so the internet's wonderful for being able to do what I would call library research on general information. But for this, it's impossible. A lot of it is in a dusty box in an archive. The tentacles of AI haven't connected with it yet, so it can't know it. And when you check on some of the stuff that's not really, nailed down, it's often wrong. On the prize piece, yeah, the Peace Prize is out of Norway. The rest of it's out of Stockholm. And there was some concession. There was so much litigation around that prize back in the late 1800s and early 1900s that there was some concession to Norway to get them by, and I can't remember the exact story. This is one of the things that AI might know this, actually, but because it's established facts. We could probably, it's knowable 5 minutes after we finish, but I can't remember the exact story.
Yeah, chat has me as listed as one of the most distinguished alums of University of Colorado, which would be so cool if I had actually gone to University of Colorado. There was one right here.
You raise your hand? I don't see you. Oh.
Thank you for doing this. It's really informative, very interesting. The books are amazing. I haven't read the second one, looking forward to it, but you've uncovered these historic figures that, today people know the names for not their historic significance. And so just wondering, as much as the books have brought them to light in a way that we knew the name, but now we know them from the history, is there a mini series or a movie, or how do you do that to bring it maybe to more people who aren't reading books today?
I would love that to happen. The Diesel book was optioned, and then the option expired, so it's currently out of option, as they say. This has not yet been optioned, but the Diesel didn't get optioned until about a month after Pub anyway. But I would love it. I look at Netflix and I see so much garbage being made there. I'm like, how are they not telling better stories here? Like, tell something that is useful for people to know, get some history in it, because it is novelistic. So I would love to see that happen. I think it would be valuable if it were put even to like there was like what was do you remember the name of the thing? I participated in one of those documentary things on Discovery Channel. Expedition Files. Expedition Files did a thing on diesel that I was like the nerd historian that they interviewed to tell the story. So that was good. Kind of told the diesel story. But I'd love to see like an actual big movie. But yeah, and the third book will be again, I haven't sort of announced exactly what it'll be, but it's a name in history that's been misunderstood or underappreciated. In the next case, like fully misunderstood, really. And certainly underappreciated. Diesel, underappreciated. Nobel, like we only know the other Nobel. But it has that same connection where you'll know the name, but then it's things you, as Mike Rowe says, things you didn't know about the names that you do.
I think we have time for one last question. Anyone? All the way over there.
It's remarkable the similarities of this time period and today. And if Nobel was around today, do you think that he'd be in the oil industry, or is there a company that you think that resembles his? And is there anyone today in the business world that you would think that is similar, has similar traits?
He'd be in something big, maybe data centers or AI or oil. I mean, it's still oil, so it could be any of those. But it certainly wouldn't be small ball. Like he'd be going big. He wasn't like a Musk exactly. Musk is more of a visionary tech, guy. I think Emanuel was just more of like a great operator. He could almost be more of like a Warren Buffett type, even though Buffett's more of an investor than an operator himself. But I see him being more of a financier type, as opposed to like a pointy-end tech innovator. But for industry, yeah, maybe data centers. That seems like the big thing now. So,
Doug, thank you for all you do for books. Thank you for writing this latest one, and thank you for coming here tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Doug Brunt.
Thank you all very much, and Seth, thank you so much. That was great. American Kings is awesome.